Republican Senators Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham are coming to Donald Trump's defense this week, accusing the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Millie, and former general and Trump Chief of Staff, John Kelly, of mischaracterizing their old boss.
Do you think people like General Millie, like John Kelly, are lying?
Yes, I do. And not more, but even if they aren't lying, or even let's say you don't want to call them a liar, I would say it's very dubious to see these accusations coming at the very last minute, right before an election.
I think General Kelly's criticisms are not based on facts. I think it's emotional, it's sad, and it's not going to matter. What happened to joy on the Democratic side? They went from joy to now Trump is Hitler. That's desperation.
Both Millie and Kelly have made headlines for sharply criticizing the former president, each describing him as a fascist who would endanger the country. Retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis is joining us now. He's the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and the author of the new novel, The Restless Wave. Admiral, thanks so much for being here with us.
My pleasure, Jessica.
You've been watching this whole thing play out publicly. I just first want to get your thoughts on what you're seeing, both from the comments from Millie and Kelly and then Trump and J.D. Vance's reaction to them and his allies.
Well, I'll start with what I know. And I know John Kelly. I've known him for 40 years. We served as junior officers together. I watched his family grow up, including his son, Robbie, who was killed under my command in Afghanistan. John Kelly is true, straight, honest. He's a rock-solid Bostonian, a hero of the United States of America. He doesn't lie. Mark Milley, I don't know as well, but I've known Mark for close to 20 years. He's a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He served under my command as a one-star in Afghanistan. I know him to be true, direct, straight, coincidentally, a fellow Bostonian to John Kelly. These are two very straightforward individuals. And I'll close with this, Jessica. They spent not minutes, not hours, not days, not months. Both of them spent years around President Trump. I take great stock in what they had to say about him.
And I'm curious, and I because you do know John Kelly so well, we've heard the former president talk very openly about what he describes as the enemy within. People here in America, Americans that he thinks are more frightening and more potentially threatening than our enemies that exist outside in the world. And he has named various politicians, but he's also posted on Truth Social that he would investigate and go after anyone that he thought was an enemy from within. Do you think John Kelly and Mark Milley, yourself, anyone might be concerned that they might be targeted if President Trump were to get back in office?
I think any idea that we would, as a nation, use political power to go after our domestic enemies ought to frighten all of us. And let's go back to the U.S. military. The U.S. military swears an oath not to the president as commander-in-chief. We certainly respect that office, but the oath that is sworn by every officer in the armed forces is to the Constitution of the United States. We are, must be, and I hope and I believe always will be, a nation of laws. That is critical. Our military will defend the Constitution in any crisis.
And I also, while we have you here, want to broaden out our conversation internationally. And I want to ask you about Israel directly striking back at Iran this weekend. Of course, that was a long-promised retaliation to Iran's attacks on Israel on October 1st. What is your thought on where this conflict is right now, especially that in that ensuing time period, Israel killed Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas?
It's a very good place at the moment for the Israelis. They've had 3 months of unbroken success going after, as you point out, Yahya Sinwar, the execrable leader of Hamas, now dead. Too much blood on his hands to even measure, including American blood. They have struck successfully against Iran. Iran has tried to strike them with very little effect. Again and again, you see Israel moving militarily. As to where it goes from here, Jessica, I think, and let's hope this is true, that things will now settle down from this cycle of violence we've seen. The Iranians don't seem to have the stomach for another round of significant retaliation. Israel has been clear that they feel this most recent set of strikes are sufficient, at least for the moment. Combat operations are winding down in Gaza. They're continuing in Hezbollah to the north. But I think the hard combat is going to be measured, I hope, in a few more months, and this thing will not widen into a true total regional war. I think the chances of this settling down are about 80% at this point. Still worrisome, but I think better than where I might have predicted a month ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much that has happened just even in the last month. And then in Ukraine, we know that Ukrainian officials are saying North Korean troops could begin fighting alongside Russian forces as soon as this weekend. It really underscores these growing ties between those two countries. And again, taking it back to Iran as well, these countries are really, we see them working together a lot. What do you make specifically, though, of these North Koreans who will be fighting on behalf of the Russians?
I think it's very concerning in terms of actual military manpower, know-how, discipline. These Korean troops will probably be at the top end of what Kim Jong-un has produced. And let's face it, North Korea is a one-trick pony. It is a nation that is simply a militarized state. And so these troops, which are currently training in Russia, will hit the front lines. I've seen numbers estimated between 3,000 and 12,000. It's a significant military addition to the forces of Russia, who are losing so many. And final thought on this, Jessica, in the midst of worrying about it, as we should appropriately, we also ought to reflect that this reflects Russian weakness. Believe me, Vladimir Putin doesn't like the image of him going on bended knee to Kim Jong-un to get troops to keep his offensive going. This is a sign of Russian weakness, but it could have real impact on the battlefield.
And just finally, we don't want to let you go without asking you about your new book. It's called The Restless Wave. Tell us what inspired you to tell this particular story.
Winston Churchill said, to look to the future, you need to understand the past. And thus this book is historical fiction set in the early days of World War II. It's a love triangle set against the horrors of the early part of the war. And it's a way, Jessica, to look back at great power war in the Pacific, something we worry about today between U.S. and China, then U.S., Japan, to worry about new technologies sweeping the battlefield as they did in the 1940s. And finally, the human cost of war comes out in the relationships between two young officers and a woman with whom they both fall in love in those early days.
Yeah, so much. Yeah, it's so true that to know about where we are today, you got to go back and you got to understand the history that came before us. Admiral James Stavridis, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jessica.